Thank you, Lydia. So hello again. My name is Rana Sukkariye. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Beirut and an organizer of the first of this series on Palestine. Actually, today, first of a webinar series that will continue with us, hopefully throughout the coming academic year and maybe years. So this is organized by RC47, which is a research committee on social movement and social classes at the International Sociological Association. Just to remind you that this meeting is being recorded, so I hope no one has any objection on that. After 2 years of genocide, all forms of genocide, after a year of war crime, can you hear me? Do you have, no? Okay. Sorry, just a second. Is it better now? Lydia, anything I can do?
I think it's your voice is breaking. I think it's for the internet connection probably. We can hear you, but
okay. Okay, so just give me
it's working.
1 minute.
No, it's working.
Okay. Okay, great. So again, I apologize for that. So my name is Rana Sukkari. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Beirut. And I'm an organizer of this webinar series along with my colleague Lydia Yanis from Manchester University. This is the first of a webinar series on Palestine. It is organized by RC47, which is a research committee on social movements and social classes at the International Sociological Association. After 2 years of genocide, all forms of genocide, war crimes on Lebanon, 2 years of war crimes on Lebanon, whether it in different forms, whether it was in its limited or extended form, or even targeted killing and others. And after wars on Iran, occupation of Syria, bombing in Yemen, and last week, bombing in Tunisia and Qatar, which is definitely not something that is recent. This is a continuation of the sector colonial project of Israel. We cannot stay silent at all. I know you are already, you have listened to a lot of webinar series, but still there's a lot that we have to do, we should do. That's why we started this webinar series in order to really, hopefully, discuss together different issues, different topics related to that struggle, but hopefully in order to deepen our understanding of the Palestinian struggle, but hopefully in order to forge more international enduring solidarity with the Palestinians and the wider region. So today we have the topic of our discussion is to debunk the myth of news anti-Semitism. And we have with us Dr. Mohammed Ayash and Dr. Anna Esther Younes. So thank you so much for joining. We'll start with Dr. Mohammed, who was born and raised in Silwan, which is Jerusalem, before immigrating to Canada, where he's a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He's also a policy analyst at Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He's the author of Lordship and Relation in Palestine, Israel, which has just been launched. So congratulations, Muhammad. And Hermeneutics of Violence, published by University of Toronto in 2019. He has published over 20 journal articles and book chapters on topics such as political violence, Zionism, and colonial modernity, secular colonial sovereignty, anti-Palestinian racism, BDS, and Palestinian decolonial movements in journals such as European Journal of Social Theory, Political Sociology, Journal of Palestine Studies, and Middle East Studies. He has co-edited 2 books. The most recent was Jeremy Weidman, and it's titled Canada as a Settler Colony on the Question of Palestine. He has written over 50 commentaries, policy analysis, and opinion pieces for Al Jazeera, Baffler, Middle East Eye, Mondoes, Arab Center, Shabaka, and among others. So, Muhammad, let's say 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Rana, Lydia, and a pleasure to be on this panel as well with Anna. And thank you all for coming. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you today about the so-called new anti-Semitism. This concept, this propaganda called the new anti-Semitism, can be dated to the 1960s, 1970s, with the Israeli government basically deciding that since they have lost the argument on the basis of facts, reason, justice, that they are going to just basically shut down the conversation. That the Palestinians' ability to narrate their own story was not something that they could just outright argue against or defeat through argumentation, so they had to defeat it through force. Much like they have expelled the Palestinians and stolen their lands and killed them and committed ongoing genocide against them through force, they were going to eliminate the Palestinian story itself, the Palestinian experience through force. And the fastest way to do that was to align the Palestinian narrative with anti-Semitism. And what they decided to call the new anti-Semitism. And for decades, the Israeli government, the Israeli state, has pushed forward a strategy that would align all honest representations of what happened in Palestine historically and what is still happening today, to align it with hate, with anti-Semitism. And what we have seen over the last decade or so, really dating back to the aftermath of the Second Intifada, is an effort to, accelerate and intensify that kind of attack by trying to codify into policies and eventually into laws the notion that Palestinian critiques of Zionism and the Israeli state are inherently hate crimes, and therefore should not be afforded protections such as protection of freedom of expression or freedom of speech or academic freedom. And that's what you see through mechanisms such as the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which was, a project that was initiated by states. It's your classic definition of a top-down process. It's not grassroots. It's not coming from the Jewish communities in Canada or Germany or the UK or the US. This is a state-operated, state-run project, and of course, it uses all its what scholars call astroturf groups, not grassroots groups, across those spaces to push forward the notion that simply stating the facts of Palestinian expulsion from their land, the fact that Israel is a settler colonial state, the fact that Israel practices apartheid within a settler colonial structure of power, and so on. And so the fact that Israel is committing ongoing genocide, not just in the Gaza Strip over the last 2 years, which is of course more intense in in scale and scope, but is part of an ongoing structure of genocide that has been unleashed against the Palestinians since I would say the early parts of the 20th century, but if you want, since at least 1948. Um, uh, so stating those facts becomes aligned with hate crime, with hate speech, with speech that is viewed as intolerant, violent, undemocratic. It does not belong to the realm of valid policy discussions or public discourse. And for us, as academics, yes, we defend this through our right to academic freedom. I'm not opposed, and I've used the argument of academic freedom to oppose things like the IHRA and the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which is the liberal version of the IHRA. I've written about this in a couple of spaces, and I'll kind of say a few things about that later. But I want you to understand that how you should situate it from an academic standpoint as well is not just an issue of an attack against academic freedom, but it is part and parcel of the colonization of Palestine. Settler colonization is about the erasure, the total erasure of an indigenous population. And that means not just physical erasure, not just physical expulsion from their lands, not just killing and death and destruction, but erasing them as a political subject. As a political subjectivity, as a political entity, as a cultural community, even that has a sovereign claim to the lands that the settler colonial power wants to claim all as its own. And so, whenever you see these kinds of efforts, you should understand that this is part of what decolonial scholars have called for decades discursive colonization. The work of Edward Said, Mohanty. They've talked about this notion of discursive colonization since the 80s, since the 70s. And this is what you're experiencing today when you see these kinds of criminalization of these narratives, is that they want to participate in the elimination of the Palestinian story, of the Palestinian critiques of Zionism in Israel, so as to naturalize and solidify and cement settler colonial conquest and to allow it to expand further. And so your resistance to that should be guided not just by your desire to protect academic freedom, but your desire to oppose colonization. If you are proclaiming yourself to be on the side of decolonization or anti-racism, and you don't fight against these kinds of concepts such as the new anti-Semitism, then you're not adding up. You don't fit into that anti-colonization or decolonization and anti-racism. You're not part of it. Sorry. You have to take a strong stand if you believe in those things. Now, how does it practice discursive colonization? Let's just take these two definitions as not the overall strategy, because there's multiple strategies. It's not just the two definitions, right? Like through which this is enacted. It's multiple. It's a larger strategy. But let's take these two definitions. There's a whole discourse out there about like how the JDA came to oppose the IHRA and save the day and allow BDS to exist on campuses. But this completely ignores what I argued right away upon reading the JDA, is that it's an Orientalist document, because it's both documents from the right and the left. Your liberal empire versus your right-wing empire. I mean, we've had this, if you know anything about the history of empire, you know that it's not always just like crazy right-wing racist discourse. It's very much liberalism that guides empire and its establishment. In fact, it cements it even better than right-wing discourse. But at any rate, so the discourse is going to look different in each, but they're both doing the same thing. They've both decided that what counts as valid and legitimate speech about Palestine ought to be determined first and foremost by Israelis and Jews, who will tell you what is and isn't anti-Semitism. So that becomes the priority, the primary entry point into anyone coming into the discussion of anything about Palestine, including BDS. Even the JDA, which was, allegedly supposed to protect BDS, it's telling you, look, we understand, if you really, really carefully, they're like, we understand why you sometimes think that BDS is anti-Semitism. I mean, the minute you start with that, you've shown yourself to be part of the colonial imperial project. There's nothing anti-Semitic about anything regarding the Palestinian struggle. It's not against Jews. It's not against Jew qua Jews, like just for being Jews. It's against Israeli Jewish settler colonial power and structure. Um, so at any rate, so they frame it as like only Israeli Jews get to define what is anti-Semitism. Only Israeli Jews also get to decide what is and is not acceptable or unacceptable speech in regards to Palestine. And so the colonized in this case is cast out of the conversation altogether. There's no room for the colonized to come in and say, "Hey, I have something to say." Like, no, you're not even allowed into it. And it frames the whole discussion so that everybody who is entering any sphere of whether it's journal articles, or a talk, or a book, or a lecture, teaching in classes, whenever you hear the word Palestine, it's both documents are essentially telling you the first thing you should do is ask yourself, is this or is this not anti-Semitism? Not what about settler colonialism? How do we defeat this project of colonial modernity? How do we view Zionism in its rightful contextualization as an ideology that is born of and for the project of colonial modernity, and so on and so forth? It removes all those questions. It just tells you, first of all, is this anti-Semitic? And so shifts all the attention and all the care and all the focus, and then makes the central subject the colonizer, not the colonized. This is what makes both colonial Orientalist documents. And the fact of the matter is, and I'll finish on this, the fact of the matter is that Zionism introduces a notion of Jewish collective existence that is predicated on the elimination and annihilation of Palestinian collective existence. Let me repeat that. Zionism is a political ideology, like all settler colonial ideologies. It is building a notion of collective Jewish identity on the basis of the eradication and annihilation of Palestinian collective identity. The second any ideology, I don't care what its content is, the second any ideology predicates collective identity on the basis of the erasure of another collective identity, that other collective identity that is destined and fated for erasure has every right, I was going to swear, has every right to participate in the discussion over the colonizing collective identity. They can't tell me, oh, I can't participate in this discussion because I'm not Jewish. I am the victim. I am the colonized person by your ideology. It is affecting me and our people with the most extreme forms of violence, including genocide. Yes, we have every right to participate in that discussion and tell you, no, you can't call something as anti-Semitic that is purely done for the political purpose of erasing us as a people. This is really weak rubbish that should be dismissed by any honest intellectual when you're faced with their talking points. But unfortunately, too many people still fall into this nonsense and agree, oh, well, right. We always let other people decide what their collective identity is. Why do we not do that for this particular community? Oh, it must be anti-Semitism. No. It has nothing to do with that. Black identity is not predicated on the erasure of another identity. In this case, Zionist Jewish identity is. So yes, we have every right to participate in that conversation, and not only participate, but actually lead it. My advice to everyone is to continue to critique all these definitions, to follow what is now, I think, become a very strong popular trend, which is whenever anti-Semitism is weaponized, is to use that word. Just tell them, stop weaponizing anti-Semitism. And because the weaponization of anti-Semitism, if we continue to let it run amok, we will continue to allow Israel to continue its brutal settler colonial genocide of the Palestinian people. And you can't separate these two things. And so you have to take a stand here and take a stand for what is just and decent in the world. Or you don't stand for that at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muhannad, and thank you for mentioning that these origins of the new anti-Semitism, because there's a belief that all this genocide and Zionist violence is due to the far-right wing government, while in reality, if I'm not mistaken, this whole invention of new anti-Semitism was with the Labour Party, right? It was during the Labour Party 1973 government, indeed. So thank you for that. And in the chat, Ali Mallah is reminding us that how can we forget? There's no way we can forget. Today is unfortunately the first anniversary of the Pagers massacre in Beirut, in Lebanon. This is a crime against humanity. This massacre that led to the blind maiming almost 4,000 Lebanese living their daily life. And today also marks the 43rd anniversary of the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, also by Israel and its allies and Lebanon. So let's move to Anna. And Anna Younes is an independent scholar whose work focuses on settler colonial and indigenous studies, racial critical theories, and psychoanalysis in Europe and in the Dutch Caribbean. Her PhD focused on what she coined the war on anti-Semitism. In her 2015 PhD dissertation, A Counterinsurgency War in the Footsteps of the War on Drugs and War on Terror. She has curated Palestinian art and has extensively written about anti-Palestinian repression in Germany. She co-authored a prized documentary on war journalism, worked as a lay judge at Berlin's juvenile court, and wrote YouTube series on decolonizing the development and the humanitarian sector. I'm going to use that in my course. I love that. Anna founded and organized the Colloquium of Color in Berlin for several years. Actually, when I asked Anna if she can join us in this discussion, I had 3 very specific questions, and I really hope that you will be able to engage us with these questions, but of course go beyond as well. So my questions were: what makes Germany a special case? How does the German case affect the general global attack on Palestine solidarity? And how does it reproduce different forms of repression? Go ahead, Anna.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you, Muhannad. It's a great, an amazing pleasure, honestly, to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with the audience and further questions. And before I jump into, I'm always invited, I'm invited to talk about Germany as the crazy pathological case amongst the nations, or the Western nations maybe. And I usually push back against it. But now, since Muhannad already started in the 60s and 70s, I'd like to start there right now as well, very briefly, and then move to Germany. So when we see the Israeli establishment, intellectual as well as political and diplomatic establishment, in particular, Abba Eban in the 60s and 70s, starting to write academic papers as well as policy papers, where he rephrases the Zionist project very concretely as an anti-racist, an anti-colonial, emancipatory, and in certain ways also socialist endeavor, obviously. That had obviously, or the origins of that have to be understood with him being as well a diplomat on the international stage at a time when decolonization globally happened. So you would be in UN meetings where Asian, African, Arab, and Central and South American states have essentially buddied up together and decried forms of colonialism, and it wasn't working anymore. The narrative was not working. So back then, the time really was different than it is today. And these Israeli establishment understood very well that in this situation, as one of the, very new settler colonial states in the heart of, the Arab and African, geographical entity, that is obviously a narrative that, in colloquial language doesn't fly anymore. So we see Abba Iban as the first leader in terms of, rephrasing this discourse. However, it's not just Abba Iban, like just recently, Donald Trump rephrased or renamed the Department of Defense into the Department of War, which it already was called until 1947, in fact. So Eisenhower, actually, at that time, when he was, after the Second World War, understood very quickly that US-American imperialism, obviously Congo is a very great example, wouldn't work anymore if, the old school language of colonialism and imperialism was to be pertained. So the US, as well as Israel, as one of its strongest allies, eventually started switching, language codes, let's say, right, on the international as well as local level. And through this, I think we can really see, and something I'll come back to that when I want to talk about counterinsurgencies, maybe. But this rephrasing is very important in order for us to understand the, long array of colonial counterinsurgencies, actually, against violent uprisings in particular, right, against colonialism, because this is, I think, at the heart of what we're seeing today globally, as well as, in particular with Palestine. Fayez, who's been, I think, the first, most well-known philosopher and thinker on what settler colonialism actually is and tried to philosophize and theorize it, actually responded to Abba Iban back then and also in his work in general, and understood Zionism as a project, a colonial project that works between the metropole that has its, racism problem, right? So there's racism in Europe, and the dialectic is to essentially outsource this problem into the colonies. Now, Fayez was very much interested in Palestine, predominantly and mainly, but this is not the first time in colonial history that this happened. For instance, in the beginning of the 19th century, when the formerly freed and relatively new Black free population in the Caribbean and the United States of America demanded political citizenship rights, right? So the same rights, the same right to vote, the same right to live, to earn money, etc., everything, all of that. The problem that arose and what people did was actually taking a certain, intelligentsia, W.E.B. Du Bois, whom you all know, for a long part of his career was a profound supporter of returning to Africa. And this is where we can see Black settler colonialism from the Americas, in fact, to Sierra Leone and Liberia, for instance. So Israel, in fact, is not the first colonial project or settler colonial project that kind of used a formerly racialized and still racialized, obviously, population within the metropole or the settler state, and then get rid of its problem by externalizing it and sending it into the colonies by basically saying, now you can have your own state, right? So in this case, Zionism, as many settler colonial studies and all of my wonderful Palestinian peers, I'm not kind of always want to exceptionalize Israel in this long array of colonialism. It actually is not. It's a very well-known strategy, in fact, and there's many more, maybe minor examples where maybe not an entire nation state happened, but certain niche projects were carved out. But that's maybe for another time. So this dialectic between European racism and, expunging it to the colonies is what is essentially at the heart of what we're also witnessing today with Israel and Palestine. Now, at the same time, obviously, around the same time when settler colonialism in Liberia and Sierra Leone happened, German intellectuals and debates have been existing on what to do with the so-called Jewish problem, right? Marx wrote about it, and many other people have been fighting about it. Germans under Bismarck, people were thinking of sending them to the German colonies or to the Bismarck colonies, imperial colonies, whatever you want to call it. So this idea, this discourse of, getting rid of this racialized population has obviously existed in Germany as well. I think what is interesting from the 70s onwards, and then in particular from the 80s onwards in Germany, is that you see a trope of German West German in particular, obviously, I'm not talking about East Germany now, maybe we can do this in the Q&A, is also a rephrasing of itself within that global discussion on A, anti-colonialism, and B, this fight with the socialist East, so to say, at this point. And the narrative that Germans adopted is that, very much in line with what the imperial powers such as the US or Israel have done, they kind of rephrased themselves by saying now we are fully on committed anti-Semite, so to say. We're fighting anti-Semitism, at least on the discursive level, even if not yet on the political level. And then in the 70s, we see the first literature evolving, essentially, where Germans write themselves as the victims of Nazism and fascism, the regular German citizen, not the political establishment. And then from the mid-90s onwards, and this is now, I'm going to jump to the European Union as a political project. Until then, the EU had essentially been a political project, right, of post-war reconstruction and so-called political economic unity. But there was no cultural or political understanding of what Europe actually means. So in the mid-90s, we do see European resolutions, essentially, that's what it's called, emerging that call for European states to fight racism, sexism, and other forms, homophobia, of discrimination. And that essentially served as one part of, or was supposed to form as one part of cultural unification. And that clashed very often with how states understood themselves. Now, Germany, as the politically leading and economically leading power at the time, and still is, in fact, was able to narrativize itself in terms of being anti-racist, framing or essentially materializing a discourse on all political levels, nationally as well as on the EU, by way of essentially funding it, if that makes sense, right? So you can only reframe European politics if you actually are one of the major economic powers that has the right and the possibility to define and redefine these discourses. So from the 90s onwards, we see that Germany actually starts not necessarily writing about racism per se, but actually jumping on the ticket of anti-Semitism and saying, now we're going to pump a lot of our educational and political and policy efforts into focusing on anti-Semitism because this is what we know best, let's say, right? So the experts on anti-Semitism are now the experts on anti-racism or anti-Semitism, in other words, right? And now we go back to the post-World War II era where everything is being reframed, right? So Germany was one of the first European countries that actually understood that the rephrasing of racism into anti-racism serves a larger political and economic goal, namely controlling a European narrative and market to the inside and outside, if that makes sense. Now, in the long durée of colonialism, again, I wouldn't say this is anything new. I think what people find exceptional with Germany is that it's been the country of the Nazis, which yeah, I mean, America is the country of white supremacists, slavers, and genociders. I mean, like, I think it's really a question of what we want to talk about, essentially, and whether fascism is only German Nazism or whether colonialism is already fascism, right? And now I'm referring, obviously, to a lot of the black radical tradition that has been saying from the very get-go that colonialism is fascism, whether that is Walter Rodney or Aimé Césaire or many other people, right? So, yeah, I forgot the third. So the second question, how does the German case affect the general global attack on Palestine solidarity? I mean, maybe here a reference to the Nazis would be interesting because the Nazis, one of their political projects was to reframe and kind of establish a new Europe, right? Not just a new Germany, but a new Europe, which failed, as we all know, we know the history. But funnily enough, now with this new liberal form of capitalist racism and colonialism, Germany is very much the one that is reframing and reformulating what Europe is and means and controlling that narrative. So that's interesting. So in that case, Germany affects the global attack on Palestine solidarity because it is the major player in continental Europe next to imperial player, I'm saying, next to obviously the United States of America and England. So that's how it affects it. On the European level, Germany is essentially producing the majority of intellectual and policy reports, academic policy report, politics. The European leaders from the EU Commission to the European Parliament to almost every nation state within the European Union, German so-called civil society organizations are the ones that are training policymakers, the judiciary, the police, the EU Commission of what this new anti-Semitism supposedly means. And we already listened to Mahannad. That is essentially what they're saying. The IRA definition, et cetera, et cetera. And how does this reproduce different forms of oppression? Well, it does reproduce different forms of oppression, as in, obviously anti-Jewish racism is pitted against anti-Muslim racism, just like, anti-Black racism has been pitted against anti-Indigenous racism in the Americas and vice versa, right? But all of that in the service of white supremacy, which means that, neither, let's say that the position of the master is foreclosed to the Black or the Muslim or the Jewish position in this case, right? You literally have to become a white supremacist settler / colonizer and imperialist in order to actually partake in power politics generally. But qua Jew, qua Muslim, qua Black or Indigenous person, you will not be granted those rights, essentially. So in this case, Germany reproduces different forms of oppression. And in my own work, I read this together with the war on drugs and the war on terror, but maybe I'm just going to keep it at that. That's it. That's how it does it.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Anna. Actually, Anna and Muhannad, you have provided us with a lot of information to think along with this information. So maybe at the moment we can just open the floor for questions. So if anyone has any question, you can please either raise your hand or you can just type it in the Q&A. Anna, if you don't mind, maybe I can ask the question. I start with you, and then maybe Muhannad, you can also give us some more information. There is like this analysis that with this definition of new anti-Semitism is also not only affecting the real anti-Semitism, and but it is also creating more Islamophobia. So, do you mind? Can you just tell us what you think about it, and if that's the case, how is that producing, whether in the case of Europe or North America?
Look, there's no new anti-Semitism. I mean, Muhannad already said the most important things, right? It's political propaganda and end of sentence. If we speak about anti-Jewish racism, I think it functions very much in the same manner that anti-Jewish racism has functioned before, namely as a tool for white supremacy, right? I mean, everybody knows the Nazis as an example, but obviously, the entire Western world has been, racist towards Jews, just as they were racist towards, other minorities. So the Jews are not an exception. So in that sense, what we would call the real anti-Semitism, right? It's just actually very vividly reproduced. We can see this in Germany in the political propaganda, obviously, that is being formulated as in you're only a real Jew if you are essentially a Zionist, which means if you're, a settler. And I think that's a stand-in, you're only a real Jew if you are behaving like a white supremacist, right? Which means, again, in other words, the third translation is we only accept you as a Jew if you literally become like us. And that I think is the the definition of racism for beginners, right? We can only accept you if you are literally like us. And I think we know from European Jewish history, those who stayed in Europe, and Germany is a good example, which has introduced the first legislations of Jewish emancipation at the same time when Black people in the central in North America, aka the Caribbean and North America, were freed. So Germany at the same time introduced emancipation acts for Jews, right? And yet still 200 years later, they ended up in Auschwitz. So we know where this kind of narrative goes if you try to appease the master in one way or another when it comes to assimilation, right? It doesn't really work. In terms of anti-Muslim racism, I mean, I think Edward Said already said it. It's the secret share of anti-Semitism, Orientalism, right? So there is no, we cannot understand that the way anti-Semitism or the new anti-Semitism discourse is mobilized is essentially to, frame the Muslim as the inestimable subject in Europe, right? And the Muslim here is a figure, right? I think a lot of people think this only concerns Muslims qua Muslims, just like it concerns Jews qua Jews. But the Jew is a signifier for, in fact, violent, radical resistance to imperialism and colonialism against the Western project. And I think at least today, the majority, if you look at the European Union or even Germany's counterterrorism lists, for instance, the majority of movements that are listed, are all A, Muslim, and B, violent. Now we can discuss which one we like and which one we don't like, right? But they all, in one form or another, are trying to fight against what we call today imperialism, right? Whether we think this is the right strategy or not, I think is up for debate. So in that sense, the figure of the Muslim stands, and we see this in the policy and political speeches of people against refugees from Africa as well as the Middle East. A lot of, we shall not forget that a lot of, African populations are Muslims as well. This is even in the Middle East often forgotten that there are Muslims in Africa, not only North Africa. So we only see the white Arab subject in a way, right? So all of this brings together this idea that Europe essentially needs to be maintained as white, and not Muslim, Oriental, Afghani, Arab, African, anything in that matter. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's it. I don't think we can understand the force of this material discourse outside of the war on terror, which is a global, imperial counterinsurgency essentially, and it mobilizes all kinds of strands to present itself as a just war. And again, we have to go back to the Department of War versus the Department of Defense when this whole narrative started. But 50 years onwards, this really has been a very productive reframing. Eisenhower called it winning over the hearts and minds of people, right? And it works, right? People actually believe this is about Jews or about Muslims, qua Muslim and qua Jew, whereas it's not. I think that's my 50 cents to that.
Thank you, Anna. Mohammed, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, just very quickly to add, it's not so much about is this hurting the fight against real anti-Semitism and how is it also hurting Islamophobia and so on. But the thing is that all these different forms of racism are interconnected. So if you are hurting the struggle against one, you're hurting the struggle against all of them. I understand the need to specify each form. I'm not against that. But we also have to always interconnect them all because they are interconnected. The age of colonial modernity introduced a form of dehumanization, a form of racialization that dehumanized all colonized, neo-colonized, settler colonized populations. The the ways in which that happened to each group will have its own specific histories and content and so on that are very important, but the general picture is relatively the same, which is to cast out of the realm of civilization a certain group of people for the sole purpose of either stealing their land, their resources, enslaving them, and so on and so forth, or a combination of all those things. So we do have to understand all of these. If you take, for example, Anijar's work, Europe constitutes itself through two enemies, the internal enemy being the Jew, the external enemy being the Arab and the Muslim. And both constitute in their, exclusion out of the realm of the human, what is today Europe, and so on. You can also add a whole host of other identities to that. Europe didn't have just one external enemy, or one internal enemy for that matter. Whoever was constituted as an enemy of colonialism and imperialism was constituted as an enemy, and that basically captures the majority of the world's population. So we do have to bring these conversations back to that interconnectedness. And if you bring anti-Semitism back into the fold of where it really belongs and to which it can contribute to a decolonization project, then we're having a real conversation about actually opposing these systems of power, as opposed to what Zionism has decided to do, which is to join them. That simple.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So we have a question in the chat, actually two questions. How do you see anti-Semitism as a tool to pursue the corporate interest? That's the big oil, the big banks, the world's military industrial complex, the big biotech, and the big pharmaceutical. Isn't this plainly a scheme for profits via the exploitation or scrambling over the Levant? Even the war on terror or the war on drugs, I think there are legitimation strategies to pursue the corporate interest, and big corporate interests have the G7 or G8 in it. Will there be an ISIS if there was no oil in the Arab world? That deserves a webinar on itself.
Can I answer to that? Phoebe, I love your question. I think, well, number one, yes, I agree. I think that was a, rhetorical question maybe. And I think, what I find interesting when you look at other racialized settler colonial states like Liberia or Sierra Leone, right? And then you look at Israel, which has been, comparatively speaking, quite successful. And I think one of the reasons Israel, or one of the many reasons, I guess, why Israel was so successful in really being, at least as such a short racialized, non-white, at least in its origin, settler colonial white supremacist project, is because it very quickly tapped into the global imperial and Western war industry. And again, and I think this is really interesting, because that is not what happened with Liberia and Sierra Leone, who've been, asking for weapons from the US and from England and military support many times to kind of quell the resistance of the indigenous population. And at some point it just stopped because, obviously we know Second World War and the countries didn't have money anymore. But bottom line being, Israel tapped into this global profiteering of war and high value technology, and started producing it, right? Already in 1948 with the first biological warfare against Palestinians, for instance. And then from there on, it was essentially further developed. And these were all technologies that today you see already, in the 60s and 70s, for instance, Israel was selling weapons to the Portuguese, to the South Africans, and to other, in particular Portuguese, in fact, because they were fighting until the 70s, right, in Mozambique. Today, they are selling agriculture business and tools developed on Palestinians as a settler colonial technology of war and erasure to the same African states that they once tried to subdue via the colonial powers that once ruled them, right? So we see, obviously, Israel is not shy of selling itself to everyone that is paying for it. Until I think last year, March, Brazil stopped buying weapons. No, Cuba stopped buying weapons from Israel. Can you imagine Cuba buying weapons? So we see Israel is essentially exporting two things mainly, agriculture business and the war industry. And they're both interrelated in terms of how they happened and functioned during colonial times in the 20th century, as well as how they are actually produced on the same body and the same territories in sync with each other, via surveillance tools and tools to essentially kill what we can call a surplus population that is not needed for the broader political project that Israel is pursuing. So yes, I agree with you. So this is all about essentially imperialism, and imperialism cannot be, to my mind, decoupled from, settler colonialism in the Americas, which actually started the first, military-industrial complex. The Dutch, for instance, were the first ones that really, on a massive scale, produced weapons and then sold it to everyone, right? From South America to the Central Americas and then eventually North America. And ISIS, I think, is a very particular example. I think what I find interesting about ISIS is that so far no American military base has been attacked. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it at, you know? And whom they're attacking is also quite interesting. So, I'm rather talking about, radical Marxist or Hezbollah even, movements in the Arab world, the Philippines, and Africa, for instance, right? And ISIS, I think, is a very particular moment in time and space, which maybe needs a different seminar.
Indeed. And ISIS never attacked Israel as well. Muhannad?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I've written about colonial racial capitalism, you can't understand Israeli settler colonialism without situating it within the context of U.S. imperialism. Before that, British imperialism. The equation is rather, sort of straightforward. Imperial powers, starting with the British and then with the Americans, found the idea of creating a settler colonial state in the region that is so rich in energy, would make such a settler colonial outpost so hated by everyone in the region because they've invaded it, and invasion is violent and destructive and causes resistance and hatred towards the invader, that they would be entirely dependent on their existence on the imperial power that enables it to carry out such a massive violent project. And that kind of dependence of existence on the imperial power ensures loyalty. It's basically that's what was the attraction for the British Empire to support the creation of a Jewish state as opposed to a Palestinian Arab state. Which, of course, we know the story. They promised them both the same thing, but really they were always seeing the establishment of a Jewish state made up of European Jews much more aligned with their imperial ambitions than the creation of a native Palestinian Arab state, who they could control, but could they control them for long periods of time? Well, I mean, the Saudis had been controlled for a long period of time by the Americans and the others, so there is that, but it's still not as stable. The Americans basically essentially come to the same calculation and the same conclusion during the Cold War, and this is why, Biden has said, multiple times throughout his career, dating back to the 80s, that if Israel didn't exist, the US would have to invent it, is because you can't replace a military base that exists in the form of a state that is more over dependent on its existence on you. You can't, it's worth every penny for the Americans as far as they're concerned. That much ability to project power in the region and have control over its energy markets. It's not just oil as a resource, but global energy markets. If you can have control over the Arab portion of the global energy market, you can control the global energy market. And that's what the American interest still is in today. And they view Israel as indispensable to that project. It's that simple. And then Israel has formed a niche for itself within that imperial infrastructure, as Anna was saying, largely through the weapons industry, but other high-tech sectors, but mostly around security, surveillance, military. Although some of that sort of technological advancement in those arenas have enabled them to also sell, technological services and products in other arenas like agriculture and so on. So at any rate, but this is kind of how Israel justifies all the money that the US pours into it. It brings, and Biden has continuously called it an investment. Investment brings you more money than you've invested. Otherwise, you don't call it an investment. That you call it, no, if you for sure don't call it the greatest investment you ever made, which Biden has used that language. It's because he sees how much money it brings back. Without these material structures, these imperial structures, colonial racial capitalism structures, there's no alliance between the two. Their alliance is based purely on interest. I don't buy for 1 minute any of the discourse around, the US support to Israel is ideological and religious. And sure, there are some people who believe these things, but take away those material structures, all that shit goes away quite quickly. It is the main driver of their alliance and what continues to expand it today. And don't be fooled by any of the reports of rifts. Oh, Trump doesn't like Netanyahu and all this soap opera drama that fills your news channels with nonsense. They're growing in the closeness of their relationship, not at all falling apart.
Thank you, Muhannad and Anna, and thank you, Phoebe Sanchez, for asking this question. So please, I want to remind you, in case you have any question, you can either raise your hand or write it in the Q&A. I have one question that was sent to me, and this person asked me not to say their name, not to mention their name. So I'm gonna just say it. Great analysis, thank you. But how can we move forward when this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is being institutionalized? How can we work to form solidarities with the Palestinians when we are being silenced in the worst way?
If I may, look, each context will be different. What I advise people is to be strategic, and operate within the confines and limits of your context at the same time that you don't give up pushing for the fight to advance the cause and to advance the struggle against this kind of suppression. So what do I mean by that? So, it's because you can't answer this question in an abstract way without knowing the details. If you're like a tenured prof and because sometimes you hear these kinds of questions from tenured prof who's really their main concern is, I might not get invited to sit on this board. You poor you. Like, I don't give a shit. Don't. But then there are people who are asking it from the perspective of, I'm going to lose my job. I'm in a precarious employment. I'm going to lose my job. My advice is don't. Do what you can to not lose your job. You can't help the cause by losing your job, and you're not helping yourself or your family by losing your job. So try to be strategic. See where you can push without exposing yourself to the best of your ability. Create collective networks. Create support networks. If you're an institution where you're let's say contract faculty and the chair is not on your side, the dean is not on your side, find people around you that can help you out, that can protect you, that find roundabout ways of working with students to help them deal with the suppression and engage with discussions with them about this issue openly and honestly, one-on-one if need be. Regardless of how your department or university might feel about Palestine and how strong they push the suppression, you still have academic freedom. Use it. Assign peer-reviewed journal articles written by Palestinian scholars and teach them. If a university or a chair or something like that comes to you and tells you, "Oh, that's anti-Semitism and you can't do that," you can challenge that. You don't be shy from challenging these things and making sure that those who might try to suppress you know that if you are going to push back. Sometimes all you need to do is show that you're going to fight and they'll back away. I've seen that too. So it really all depends on the context. So I say do it strategically, do it smartly to not hurt yourself. And if you're worried, but for those worried about things like status and invitations and all that, I have nothing to tell you but to drop these superficial, unimportant things in life and pursue what is real, which is justice. So it really depends on the situation. And I assume, Rana, everybody here is within academic institutions, more or less, or the audience, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So the person, just for context, the person who sent me this message is a student in North America.
Okay, so for students, you still also have some level of academic freedom. Like people can't just tell you, "Oh, you can't write this essay or I'm going to fail you." You can challenge that. Now, if you're in the US, obviously you're facing a hellstorm right now. So leaders are being put in prison and expelled from programs, expelled from the country. So work collectively, for sure. In that situation, as students work in collective groups, like form groups. If they don't exist, if they do exist, join them. Do it anonymously. Do some of your organizing anonymously. It's okay to kind of be strategic. I know some of the students sometimes think, "Oh, strategic means I've given up on my moral values." No, you can be both. It's not like either strategic or moral. You can be both. Being strategic just means that you're enabled to you protect yourself so that you can continue to fight. Everybody engaged in resistance does that. You can't just if you know your head is gonna get well, I don't want to use a violent imagery, but if you know you're gonna get hurt by doing something for sure, and it's not going to lead to anything good, don't do it. What's the point? You're just going to get hurt and not achieve anything. So if all you can do is small advancements here and there, then that's all you can do. Just do those. You're still advancing the struggle in your context if you're making even small gains. So continue. Don't give up on it, but also be strategic and smart. And there is strength in numbers. There is safety in numbers. So always work with each other and with others. Don't work on your own.
Thank you, Muhannad. Anna, do you have any advice?
I think I'm gonna be, I don't know, a little bit of a killjoy here maybe. And I think I've never been really strategic and I don't really know what that means, honestly, as well. I think what can I say? I think, coming from a global north position, right? And I think that's very, like, that is where I locate myself, and this is where I had most of my struggles. And, this narrative that there's strength in numbers and being anonymous, being in a group, I think, and, I think you all have to choose your own path. At the end of the day, you need to choose what kind of life you want to live, right? That on an individual philosophical level. But if we look at what is at stake right now, and I think it's always been at stake, but it's just kind of coming to the fore a bit more now, is that we are entering an era of high value technological surveillance where those who resist global imperialism are simply bombed into the ground. And Gaza right now is, and this is where, I always say, look, this is not like the Nazis, because the Nazis literally were hiding all of that stuff. I can go on and how Israel is actually completely doing the opposite of what the Nazis did. But anyways, we are actually witnessing on purpose. This, I think, is structurally put in place on purpose. We are witnessing what is going to happen to you if you resist. Now, if I sit in the global north and say, I want to protect my own job, which is a very bourgeois problem to my mind, which my Palestinian peers in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in 48 Israel proper do not have the chance. They cannot be anonymous, A, because surveillance cameras are everywhere. The drone is buzzing over your head, right? Facebook, your name, everything is essentially controlled, especially since post-COVID. And this is a technology that is now being put in place or has been put in place already by many nation states across the world, not just Israel, the US, Germany, and China, right? This is a global problem by now. So this kind of, saving one person and then, feeding the majority to, leaving them to die or something because, they do not have the privilege of hiding almost, like maybe this is the wrong terminology or of, being anonymous, like literally. I mean, and I mean this like very, 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 this is a real problem, So I think what I would suggest to the student, this is not just about Palestine, right? So again, Palestine is a stand-in for a future that is already there, where a never-ending, genocidal regime is now showing that we are moving from a never-ending war situation, as in, since Vietnam to the global war on terror, to never-ending genocide if you do not agree with how our imperial projects are going to be, right? And in that sense, and we see this in the US unfolding, right? I mean, people, whether that is Latinos, Black people, like this is a larger problem. We need to develop a very radical consciousness and center the question of violence. And where are we within the larger project of colonial violence? And I think this is where we have to very honestly situate ourselves. Very honestly. And I'm not saying read Frantz Fanon one more time, but maybe read Frantz Fanon one more time and think about what does it mean to be at the receiving end of violence for 500 years, or maybe since 1425, since the first European slave ships left African shores with a huge number of people on it, right? We need to really ask ourselves, are we going to write a letter to the president of the university, where the colonial university is part and parcel of colonial education? The reason why we're having certain identitarian debates is precisely because these conversations have been put in place and kept separate and pitted against each other by the colonial machine. So really, I think, again, and I don't want to be too much of a killjoy, but we need alternative ways to mobilize against a capitalist system that has no problem anymore killing you, whether you are anonymous or not. Or maybe just social death, which is already worse enough, right? But that moment needs to be centered in our conversations around how do we mobilize and fight back? Because if the stakes in the global West are mainly losing your job, then we haven't moved since old colonial, bourgeois problems that have not been, in line with the war in Algeria, but they didn't want to lose their job, or the killing of enslaved people in Haiti, like this is a debate for me that is just as old as colonialism. I think if we want to attack racial capitalism, we need to center question of violence and where we are going to position ourselves, because people have been dying to fight against colonial violence, and now we can ask ourselves, where did it lead us? But the system that has been implanting it has definitely become stronger. So the question is really, how are we going to respond to that? And I don't think, Hannah, all my love to you and your work, seriously, but personally, my own experience trying to protect myself has not worked, because there is a moment, and this is what colonial fascism is, where they don't care, where any kind of deviance is seen as a threat. And this is, I think, in the US, you can, this is literally unfolding and everybody's like, oh my God, how can this happen? I mean, it's always been like that. The university is a site to decolonize, not a site to write little letters and write a paper. We need to find alternative ways to colonial education, destroy the system, quite literally. That's my serious. And I know when I say this, people are like, "Oh my God," but and I understand. I want to have a regular income too. But fast forward 20, 30, years from now, the question is, who is going to still have a job from all of the people that are still here on our little screen? And that's a serious question, right? So I think the question now we're looking at is from an individual perspective. But this has never been an individual question. And, I know that your group will not protect you. If they want to single you out, they will single you out. This is precisely how it works, with or without anonymity. That is my experience. And ask fighters in Palestine, maybe to, or Lebanon, Rana, like the pager attack, you just said it, right? The pager attack is a very good example of trying to establish networks of resistance that work anonymously, at least, protecting individuals with their names and their families. And what happened, right? So I think we are still a little bit, we still need to catch up with the system of surveillance, because I think we still haven't fully understood how far it reaches, actually. We're still kind of kept in this debate of very liberal self-protection and self-harm and all of that stuff, but give it a few more years and I think people will understand what a lot of radical thinkers and many of the Black radical tradition have been saying for a very long time, like we need to undo capitalism. But how? I think the question today, as Manon said, every generation has to answer this question anew and pose this question anew, right? Because technologies and the way powerful states learn from each other develops and becomes better.
If I may, if I make,
Yes, go
yeah,
ahead,
if I may
please.
come back, because there's some things that I very much disagree in how you're portraying what I said.
No.
No, it's okay, it's okay. So the advice that I'm giving is not about this liberal self-harm and all that nonsense, but it's stuff that Palestinian fighters, including armed fighters, do in Palestine. Lebanese armed fighters do in Lebanon. They don't just. Do you think the fighters are just like, oh yeah, I'm going to do a suicide mission today, every day? They protect themselves. They act strategically in the war zone. So strategic action, you say, I don't know what it means. Well, okay, I'll give you a simple example of what it means. It means we needed in Canada to get academic associations or faculty associations, unions, to oppose the adoption of the IHRA. Strategic means we're going to centralize academic freedom in that discussion. It makes our job a lot easier to do that. And guess what? The outcome that we wanted was a strong push from below, from the faculty associations, to tell anybody who's going to move from the top down, which is what we knew that they were going to do. They're going to go to university presidents. So let's go to the natural enemy of the university president, the faculty association and the union, and tell them you need to oppose this before they come to them, so that the message is delivered to the university presidents before the lobby gets to them. And we needed to do that quickly. And we knew that the fastest way to do that is by framing it under academic freedom. It worked. The end result that we needed is that this would not be adopted by Canadian universities. That was the goal. That was the strategic goal of the campaign. So you take strategic steps to try to achieve that. That's strategic thinking that delivers tangible effects and results that do exactly what you want them to do, which is stop this adoption at the university level. And we had pretty good success of doing that in Canada. When I say don't get just fired, when it's that that's going to be the outcome, it's being strategic. So we do know that you do need mass withdrawal of participation from systems of power in order to oppose them. There's not even a semblance of that kind of movement in Canada, the US, and Germany, or anything like that to do mass withdrawal of participation. So what you're going to end up with is some people acting as if there is mass withdrawal of participation, taking all the hits individually, and nothing is going to actually be affected from that. You're just losing part of your numbers. You're losing all kinds of people who are resisting in your movement individually, because you're not thinking strategically. So it's nice to just like say, oh, we need to destroy these systems and institutions. I don't disagree with that, but how do you get there? You got to have strategic thought to get there. You can't just destroy these institutions. Are not just like weak institutions that are ready to be destroyed. These are very strong institutions with enormous power. And unless you undertake collective action, which is why I emphasize group work and collective work, and there is safety in numbers. It's not absolute safety. Nobody said that. You can get picked apart, but what you want to do is that the group is strong enough that when some people get picked apart, it doesn't destroy the whole group. You also want to make sure that that continues over long periods of time in its resistance. Um, uh, so so. So when I tell especially students, don't just do action that you know will result only in negative effects, but will not lead to positive effects. I think that's wise advice. I think that's helpful for the movement in general. It's not to fall into some liberal notion of like, oh, just make sure that you're living comfortably. If people as individuals are just withdrawing their participation, that does nothing. Mass withdrawal or participation is only effective when it is done en masse. To build that kind of mass withdrawal or participation requires enormous amounts of organizing and mobilization over many years. And I've certainly never seen it in Canada. I've never seen any even inkling of that kind of mobilization being even possible here, let alone people doing it on a serious scale. I would also say the same is in elsewhere. So really, and of course, I was born and raised in Palestine. I know the stakes are higher in Palestine. I'm well aware of that. I know that there's nothing that I can experience here that will be anything compared to that. I'm willing to risk a lot, but it's also silly to just ask everyone to risk it willy-nilly. If we do take the risk, and we will not overcome these structures until we take major risks. But you have to take the risk collectively. If you take it individually, you've already lost, and it's not going to lead to anything good. So we do need actually massive, massive collective risks in order to properly undo these structures. But I don't see this as a moment where that's happening right now, unfortunately. Yeah, please don't associate me with these kind of liberal, do no harm and just hope to protest and raise awareness and that will achieve everything. I'm well aware that that's not the case. But again, to destroy these systems, you have to be strategic. And this whole notion that if you are strategic, then you are letting go of your morals or anything like that. This is, I find this a very North American viewpoint, very Western European viewpoint, that not only held by white people. I'm not saying that it's held by many people in these spaces. That I find silly. I'm sorry, but like I find silly and not at all relatable to my experience of real mass struggle that I experienced in Palestine, where there was tons of strategizing, tons of strategic thinking, almost on a daily basis. Yeah.
Can I briefly say something on that? Mohanad, I wasn't actually talking about what you said predominantly. I come from a place and a location, aka the wonderful country of Germany, where this kind of neoliberal, and again, as you also said, this is not just about white Germans, where this belief in the state, the belief in reform, um, and obviously this very real fear of losing bourgeois privileges of having a well-paying job and the hope and the idea that the liberal project ever since colonialism has garnered that you can be a moral freedom fighter and have a career right at the same time, and be celebrated for it in your lifetime, right? I mean, that's like we know we celebrate people after they're dead, 100 years later, but this idea was furthered also, probably by American imperialism in Hollywood, that you can achieve all of that. And I think there are a few people that we like to hold dear who in certain ways embody that, but I also always wonder, what time period did they emerge? Would they emerge now? And what did they actually not talk about in order to get there even during their time, right? But that's a different question, but very much obviously important and related. What I meant really when I talk about centering violence in this discussion is not to center, I don't think it's wrong to write, the petition that you were talking about, for instance, right? And center strategically freedom of speech and research at university. I don't think that's wrong. This is not I don't believe in morality as as my metal detector, let's say, right? I think there is a big difference between ethics and morality to begin with. But what I really mean is we need to come back to a radical consciousness. And I think there has been in the 60s and 70s, right? That was there. Globally, there was a moment of, the so-called global South, in parentheses, but also within the global North, of, movements, the American Indian movement, Black Panthers, obviously in the Caribbean, and anyways, so on and so forth. All of that. So there was a time when that actually happened, and state projects have very productively co-opted these struggles, turned them into, now define racism and anti-racism, right, instead of movements. And that makes it very difficult for people to actually still maneuver. Plus, at the same time, we have less and less spaces where we can do radical organizing. It's been very much, and Bell Hooks writes about this in her work as well, it's been very much relegated, radical thought, so-called radical thought, relegated to the university. So you kind of take it out of the street, away from the street, and domesticate it in the ivory tower, let's say. Now I'm an academic. I don't have a stable position. I'm like hustling from like sidekick to sidekick, let's say. But I think there's something very important in understanding this. And what do we do with radical forms of resistance and talking and thinking about this? And I think Palestine has brought this to the fore. But okay, we're talking about Palestine now, but Palestine stands in for a genocide in Congo. There are people shoveled and pushed into mines, children, that we don't talk about because the technology that is generated from Africa, right, is not, available to the majority of citizens that are laboring in the mines in Africa, right? For instance. So even if we do talk about, minor successes in terms of broadening debates, right? And let's say human rights conversations for Palestinians as Palestinians, we still haven't really decolonized the structure. There's still indigenous people in Canada that are literally shot if, the gas company wants to get into this territory, even if everybody mobilizes together. And that is literally, or people just getting shot from outside of the cars, right? Because that's what Canadians apparently like to do, white Canadians. But so that's really what I'm talking about. What do we mean when we mean decolonizing Palestine? I think Palestine, just as much as Congo once in the 70s or Vietnam stood for, is a global imperial system of war. And I know you agree with that, but what I rather meant is that we need to develop a more radical understanding again, not shy away from addressing the question for our movements of what violence means, because we've also been pacified. Again, very different. There have been different strategies, taking it from the streets into the universities, killing its leaders, more capitalist endowment projects of, social services, and so on and so forth. I mean, we can talk about this for ages, but essentially people have been domesticated in terms of not really discussing violence and using violence. That's really what I'm talking about. And even if we just start thinking about it, I'm not saying pick up an arm tomorrow. I'm just saying I think we need to center the question of violence and what that means for us fighting back. That's really all that I wanted to say. But direct action, I think, is a great example, maybe to be more concrete. But that's really all I meant.
Thank you, Anna. On that note, as I told you, this is the first webinar of this series, and we will be having in March a webinar about solidarity with the Palestinian and anti-colonial and radical perspective. So hopefully by that time, we'll be all the time thinking about the same questions. So the last question that we have is also from Febe Sanchez. I apologize in case I mispronounce your name. We know who stood to bleed from modernization and westernization as reasons for colonization of the South, But resistance is always labeled as terror or radicalization. But how can we correct that?
By
It's just
developing a radical consciousness.
so if I may just very quickly, liberation of Palestine, decolonization of Palestine ain't coming from the West. It's not coming from the West. It's not going to happen from here. I'm sorry, but yeah, I read the radical tradition. I support it and all of that. I don't see it, as you said, right? I don't see it in organizing here. I don't have much hope in organizing coming from these spaces. As far as I'm concerned, if you can throw a wrench in Canada or in the US or in the UK into the alliance between Israel and those countries, if you could just throw a wrench into their operation, you've done something. You've done something pretty good. Make it harder for them to continue business as usual. You've done something. So no, I'm well aware that a campaign against IRA is not going to decolonize Palestine. It's stupid to think that. It's not going to. But it's going to throw a wrench. It's not going to make it so easy for them to operate business as usual. And if you can do that here, you've done something. But ultimately, there has to be a much more serious reawakening of that radical consciousness in the global South. This is what worries me the most. This is what more my attention goes to, is that even in those spaces, um, that consciousness is needs reawakening. Let's just put it that way. Look at the Arab world alone. Yeah, there's a lot of popular support, and some of that popular support does exhibit radical consciousness, not all of it, but some of it does, but nothing in the regimes. Absolutely nothing. The fucking EU is about to do something maybe even more than the OIC, and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Morocco and Egypt and all of them. There is a huge problem that we need to talk about within global South countries and spaces that needs a re-energized confrontational not just words, but posture and actions towards the West. That needs to start to happen now. It can't be just something that you hear about, oh, it's happening behind closed doors. No, this needs to be concretized in action, in policies, not just in words of condemnation and this and that. If the global South continues to miss this opportunity to galvanize itself in an anti-imperial direction, I don't know when it will. I really don't. So that's where I want to direct that kind of question to.
Thank you, Muhannad. Anna, last words.
I mean, I think I agree with Muhannad, and again, I'm sorry for coming back to Fanon again, and I bet he's the daddy I never had, but no, when Fanon talks about that, the answer, I mean, this question of like Europe, participating, or the European working class participating in decolonization, right? It's already been answered by him to my mind. But he eventually says the answer to, whether it's anti or decolonial struggle is in the elsewhere, right? It's not in Europe, it's not in the metropole, right? Or in the settler colonial north of, although for me, the rest of the Americas is also settler colonialism. But anyways, North America. I don't think we can find it there because pacification there is real. Whereas in the global South, the pacification, real in terms of the majority of the population, in fact. Whereas in the global South, there is a, regime that is pacified, that tries to kind of suppress, torture, kill its own people. I think there's still there's still different analytics at work here where we could play and work with. I'm going to close my window now. I'm in Jordan. And rising radical consciousness again. I think people are ready, and what once was Vietnam for many people, whether that is for Cubans or for the Black Panthers who've been looking at or even Palestinians, thinking, look, if they can do it, we have to be able to do it, right? And I think this is what Palestine exemplifies today. So hopefully there's going to be a reawakening of this, question of violence and a more radical moment in the global South. I also think the answer is in the global South, or whatever we want to call the global south. Many of them are in the global north, but you know what I mean. So yeah, that's, but how do we do that? I think through, actually reaching out and teaching, talking, mobilizing, organizing, really. But yeah, I mean, I'm also a bit pessimistic. I still see the surveillance state everywhere. And I think the reason why they are, why their citizenship is obviously to control people's movement. So it's even more difficult than in the 70s, right? To even move and visit each other, and get the funding for an airplane ticket. So I think we need to actually really sit down and discuss what that means in a high tech surveillance era. You know, what does violence mean in this during this time?
Thank you so much, Anna. Although you ended it in a very pessimistic way, but it is the reality. Thank you so much, Mohannad. I just need again to shout out to Lydia Yanyes, who really worked on all these logistics. Thank you, Lily, for being here with us. And I want to tell you that our next session will be on the 20th of November, and it will be about political economy of the occupation and the genocide. So definitely we will be advertising that sometime by end of October. And by that time, hopefully you will know exactly who will be with us presenting. Again, Anna, Mohannad, thank you so much. Thank you for all those who attended, and have a lovely day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much for putting this together. Bye bye.